So this event is brought to you by Amnesty International, Okanagan, and United Against Discrimination, which is a project run by KCR Community Resources, also known as KCR, in collaboration with University of British Columbia and Resilience BC. So Amnesty International, Okanagan, for those of you who might not be familiar with, it's a global nonprofit human rights organization. They're committed to upholding and advocating for human rights for everyone. And KCR is the key immigrant settlement services provider in the Central Okanagan. It is a not-for-profit agency fostering diversity, collaboration, and resourcefulness by tailoring services to meet community, family, and individual needs. So now I'm going to pass the floor to our next speaker, Imogene. We have a few wonderful guest speakers in store for you tonight, as well as opportunity for questions and answers. So Terry and I will be monitoring the chat for questions you may have. Please feel free to enter your questions in the box. And our program is scheduled to run until 8 p.m. So our first presenter tonight is Dr. Imogene Lim. And I'm spotlighting Imogene. So Dr. Lim is an anthropologist at Vancouver Island University. For the past 2 decades, she has focused her research interests on Vancouver Island primarily, ethnicity in Canada, and Asian Canadian history, including food and culture. She co-developed the exhibit 150 Years and Counting, Fighting for Justice on the Coast. She actively serves her community, which includes the Coal Creek Historic Park Advisory Committee and the Chinese Canadian Museum Society of BC. Currently, she's collaborating with the Nanaimo Museum on a virtual exhibit. So please welcome Dr. Imogene Lim.
Thank you for the introduction, Wan, and thank you all for being present. And as I've indicated on my first slide, I'm zooming in from the ancestral territory of the Snuneymuxw peoples and give thanks for their welcome to settlers and other Indigenous peoples who now live, learn, and thrive here. So Haichka. So I was asked to give a background on Asian Canadian history. And actually, when I was first asked, it was presented as Asian history in BC. And I made a point of putting the Canadian in there because it is Canadian history and it happens that I am of Asian ancestry. And I also happen to be a head tax descendant. So I'm framing this to give us a bit of background to the racism that we've been seeing specific to Asians that has been associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is my grandfather in the sense of his name. He arrived in 1890, Lumnapbon. And I just want to make a point that I'm making reference to him in 3 different instances, and his name looks a little bit different in each case. So I'm not going to go into great detail about the spellings, but it may be of interest to you in the question and answer, so I'll just leave it at that. So I wanted to show you this document because it's the General Register of Chinese Immigration. And this recorded basically anyone of Chinese ancestry who came to Canada between 1885 and 1949. So it's a way to track one's ancestors as such, but because of the way that names were listed, that can be a bit problematic. In any case, what I wanted to highlight is, and I've got this, I think you can see my pointer, that a fee was paid. So this is $50. This is the first head tax that came in 1885. The other thing about this particular register is, besides giving the name, it says what village my grandfather came from, and it's Lamukde. So for me, that's a marker to indicate my origins. The other thing is it indicates occupation, and it shows that my grandfather was a laundryman. So this was a fairly common occupation for many early Chinese. They were laborers or they were laundrymen. If you were so lucky to have money, then maybe you might be a merchant. So all this information is important to looking at one's origins. And what I noted in this particular document is that my grandfather came from San Francisco, arriving in Victoria. So this is, again, the general register, but it's dating from 1910. And so basically you see that in the interval, Grandpa, look at over here in the corner, he's become a merchant. And because he's become a merchant, this has allowed him to bring his wife in. So it says, so if you saw the larger thing, it would say merchant's wife and then a son. So these individuals are now exempt because they are of the merchant class. And again, what I had pointed out is the business of the name. If he was still a laborer or a laundryman, he would have had to pay $500, which, as we know, at that point in time would have been a fair amount of money. So part of establishing head taxes was a way to decrease the number of individuals of Chinese ancestry coming into Canada. And so I've got the census dates from 1881 to 1911. And part of looking at the early Chinese coming into BC is that it is Canada's history as well. So you can see the numbers here listed for Canada and how many were actually located in BC. So in 1881, 99.24% of all Chinese were in BC. And it's only in the 1951 census is that you see the Chinese population in BC less than 50%. So this is part of the reason why over time in this early period of quote unquote BC's development, that there was a lot of specifically anti-Chinese racism because we were so visible. That was the reality of it. So here's the head tax amounts, 50, 100, and 500. And I think what's interesting is the statement that I've got copied here, that the BC government received approximately 40% of the 20 million total of the tax revenue collected through the head tax. So most people recognize that, you know, I'm sure a number of you have heard that 23 million was received over this time period, but very few realize that the BC government received a substantial proportion of it. 40% is, you know, a fair amount of money. We're not talking about, you know, just a few $100,000. We're talking about millions of dollars too. And this rise in the head tax was a way to reduce the numbers of Chinese coming in. So you might think, okay, well, how much was $500 at this time? So in sort of doing a bit of homework for this particular presentation, I found in the Orchard City Record of 1909 an advertisement from the Central Okanagan Land and Orchard Company, and they were offering cheap residential lots. So remember, 1909, and they said prices $250 and upwards on easy terms. So just think, $500 could have gotten you 2 lots. two quote unquote cheap lots in Kelowna, right? And then this I've taken from 1912, Kelowna Orchard City Record, and it says that the receipts from the head tax would be $1 million greater than the last year. And that part of this was, you know, and for those who were against having Chinese, they noted no increase in the number of Chinese landing in Canadian ports. So clearly the head tax was having some effect. Ultimately, the way of preventing Chinese from coming, because even with these head taxes, the government still felt that there were too many coming to Canada. So they, in 1923, they enabled this Immigration Act, and you can see it written as either Chinese Immigration Act. It's also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this particular event occurred on July 1st. So July 1st, you know, is Canada Day and we celebrate it. But because this particular act became law July 1st in 1923, Chinese Canadians from that time period viewed it as Humiliation Day. And I don't think a lot, very many of our younger individuals or even more recent Chinese Canadians know that particular point. Humiliation Day. And why was it a humiliation? BC would not be connected to Canada if not for the railway workers. They lost their lives in building the railway. They were part of building Canada. And yet, this is the only one group that is excluded very blatantly. And what I've highlighted here, so this is, you know, like you had to register within 12 months of the act. And it says, every person of Chinese origin or descent in Canada, irrespective of allegiance or citizenship, shall register. So this was very significant that you had to register. And it didn't matter whether you were born in Canada or not. And this comes to the reason why I have in possession these documents from both my mother and father. They're the registration certificate required by that 1923 Act. So you see it written here, Chinese Immigration Act, Chapter 38, 1314, George V. And this is dated 1924. So this is my dad. He's just a little boy. And there's a registration number. The CI thing is a certificate of immigration, and there's a whole list of different numbers. And note it says Department of Immigration and Colonization, Chinese Immigration Service. And this is why when we talk about decolonization, I always say decolonization is also pertinent to those early racialized settlers, because we were faced with colonial policies that directed how we either came or went and how we lived. So this is a fine print. So note that it says controller of Chinese immigration. As well, the certificate says this does not establish legal status in Canada. So in essence, the certificate established the fact that the government did not see you as a Canadian. You did not belong. You had to be controlled. That's why we have a controller of Chinese immigration. And this goes back to looking at that general register of Chinese immigration. This is the only population that there is these ledgers in the Library Archives of Canada, identifying all these individuals who came. The other point that I wanted to make about the registration, if you did not register, it's actually in the Act. If you did not register, you could be fined $500. And the $500 was basically the amount of the head tax at that point in time. It would have been still used at that time. So it's not just being fined at $500. It's and or including 12 months of jail. That's significant. Fined and or jail. 12 months. Once more, my granddad. Handsome devil, isn't he? Looks quite distinguished. He died in 1924. And I was looking for some other bit of information from the Cumberland Islander, and I was actually shocked that I basically found his obituary because it's an English language paper. So this is from the May 1924 Cumberland Islander. It's actually on the first page, and it says, the deceased had been a resident of Cumberland for 30 years and was very highly respected among the Chinese of the district. So remember, my grandfather came in 1890. And as I say to folks, he just boogied on up to the island, to Cumberland, and he planted his roots there with his family. So in this particular obit, it also states he left behind a widow, 6 daughters, and 3 sons. So what you don't know is the last child was born in 1923, and he died in 1924. And if you look at the date, he died, you know, so close from when the immigration Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, in terms of the requirements of being documented comes into play. So what do you do for a widow with so many children? And I know that there's one of the personalities in Kelowna, and they talked about, oh, she had 10 children. I would also say that if you looked at other people in the community at that time period, they also were having as many children. It was not an unusual thing to have many children. And so to highlight that, oh, these Chinese are having so many children, it's like everybody had those many children. There wasn't, quote unquote, birth control, right? But the fact that it's emphasized to a particular population is also stigmatizing them for the aspects of daily living in the community. So my family, they returned to China in 1928 because it was easier. So when you're back in the village, you're with your larger family. They take care of you. And I think anybody that has a large extended family knows your family raises you up. It supports you. So this is my cousin. So remember in the beginning, I mentioned that my grandfather had a son come with him in 1910. That's my Uncle Kelly, K's son. And he was an adopted son from the first wife. So my grandmother is the second wife. That's another story. I won't go into this. But I did that sort of roots finding thing back in 2009. I wanted to see where my family came from. So I purposely went to see my mother's village and my father's village. And I met this woman who is my cousin, my Uncle Kelly's daughter. And in Chinese, so in English, she's my cousin, a first cousin. But in Chinese, she's my daijia, my elder sister, because of that relationship between our fathers. Anyways, in 2016, the last time I visited China because of a conference, I purposely went to the village because I was aware that I could acquire the family genealogy, which was important, you know, where are your roots? So I got to meet my cousin again, my daijia, and she's babbling away to me in the Toisanese dialect. And, you know, part of that whole colonization process of being Canadian, I didn't take pride in being of Chinese ancestry. So I did not actively attempt to maintain my language skills. And this is a common refrain. In any case, because I had grown up hearing it, I kind of understood what my daijia was saying. And it broke my heart because she pulled out, she actually came out, she had a plastic bag full of photographs, and she pulled out and she said, "This is my father." And this is what hurt so much. She said, "I never met my father." And why wasn't she didn't meet her father? It was because of that legislation. So by the time it was possible that maybe she might have been able to come, she was too old, because there was an age limit if you had, you know, children back in the old country. And as a statement of this is a family from Nanaimo. And I've got on the screen, it says 20 years separated. And the headline actually says 60 years. So they were in fact celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary, but they had only been together 40 years. And why was it that they were only together 40 years? Again, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese Exclusion Act had definite impacts on families here in British Columbia, as well as those, as I say, in the old country. And I had the opportunity to interview the eldest son of this family. So it's the Jung family. And Jung arrived when he was 9 years old. But like many people, he went back to China for an arranged marriage. And because of the Exclusion Act, his wife was separated from him. And he had gone back, obviously, to spend some time, had a child. And his son said that he and his mother were the first Chinese to arrive in Nanaimo in 1949. And the act was repealed in 1947. So again, a 20-year separation. So that separation of females or wives from their husbands, and the fact that the children, for the most part, were not there, obviously had an impact on the communities. So I've taken this information from a volume, an older volume from 1982, and you can see that there were what the male-female ratio was. And 1921 was prior to the Exclusion Act. So you can see the differences in terms of numbers of individuals. And for some people, they don't realize the significance of Chinatowns in this early period. So today we think of Vancouver, Victoria, but if you look in the 1921, Cumberland's listed, Vernon, Nanaimo, New Westminster. So numbers declined over this time period. And this was what was the desired outcome. So I've got here the covers of 3 particular books, 2 by Dr. Patricia Roy and 1 by Dr. Peter Ward. And what you see in 2 of them is this notion of a white province or a white Canada. And Asians, so it's not just Chinese, but Asians in the sense of Chinese, Japanese, and South Asians were viewed as problems. And I think the titles in themselves say what is needed to be stated in the sense of that particular attitude. So I've got on the screen the 1902 Royal Commission. So this is the second one. There were in fact 4 Royal Commissions on what they called Orientals or Chinese. So the fact that there were 4 Royal Commissions is an indication of how the government saw Asians as being problematic, okay? So you can see here that I've taken 2 particular quotes from the Royal Commission. And what I wanted to highlight is it says Chinese were a servile class, and a servile class was necessary for the higher development of the Anglo-Saxon race. Talk about exploitation, right? And that notion of how people of Asian ancestry were unassimilable. And this was a reason to prevent their coming. So as a 3rd generation Canadian, what I can say, I am so assimilated that the last time I visited China, and remember I said I don't speak, I got yelled at for not being able to speak. So so my going to China told me I don't belong there. And yet in Canada, I'm also told I don't belong here. So here is, this comes from the Kelowna Record of 1913. And you can see that there was this debate in the community. And they make mention of quote unquote Hindus. So if you were of South Asian descent, it didn't matter whether you were Hindu or Sikh, everybody was quote unquote Hindu, okay? And you can see that whether you were Japanese or South Asian, you were lumped with Chinese. So, and note from the first statement, it says, we got nothing here but the riffraff of the seaports of the Chinese coast, okay? And then somebody was debating on the plus side, that comment about the good workers. So you could say the same thing. When it came to building the railway, yes, the Chinese were needed and wanted, but as soon as the railway was built, bye, time for you to go. We don't need you. So as I said, I did a bit of homework in looking at Kelowna. And so this is a 1914 map. You can see what was Chinatown. I've put red stars for the places that were identified as Chinese. So this is what you call a fire insurance map. And one of the things in the historic research that I've been doing is when you get the fire insurance maps, they tell you a lot of information, which is quite interesting, but they also mark on the map these early non-white settlers. So if you were Japanese, they'd have you listed. If you were Chinese, they'd have you listed. I haven't seen enough maps that indicate whether South Asians are indicated, but I know the Vancouver maps that I've seen, they had African Canadians marked on the map. So why is it that they're marking those particular individuals? The other thing that I would say is, where are those communities located. They're not in the heart of the downtown. They're always on the margins. And when you look at those communities, that's a statement of where they were allowed to reside. It was not a matter of like, hey, I want to go live there. This is where you're allowed to live. So when I think about Cumberland and the Chinatown there, people note they're in the sort of marshy, swampy area. And it's like, why would anybody purposely live in a swampy, marshy area? It's because that's where they were allowed to live. So it's an important reminder to us that there has been this segregation, and it was not self-imposed. It is what society imposed on the community. And here is an example from Vancouver about how, again, Asians were perceived, or quote unquote, the undesirables, people of color and the poor. And what I would say about this notion of where people are allowed to live and or purchase property is that, and I don't know enough about Kelowna. So like, I'm thankful for being able to do this webinar, because I did some homework. I actually explored Kelowna when I hadn't done it before. So thank you for expanding my horizons in terms of research. So I looked at this, like I said, in other places, they have put covenants on buildings, houses. So are you allowed to make the purchase or even live there? So the covenants that I've been aware of, and this is in Port Alberni, and certainly in Vancouver and in West Vancouver, there may be other places, that they actually state that if you are of Asian, African Canadian, Indigenous, if you are in the building, it's because you work there as a servant. It's not because you actually own and live there. Okay. So here you have these attitudes that separate people. And going to the Kelowna Record of 1920, and you can see the headline here. And this makes a point of what those earlier book titles are that I had indicated. So here it says, the mining boom had first brought the Chinese and labor needs, had later attracted, and again in quotes, Japs and Hindus, because of course these are not appropriate terms to use, but this is how the language was used at the time, that this province was to be a British Columbia or something else. It was time to take some steps. So again, that notion of a white province, the British in the British Columbia. And I think it's interesting that these words or the sentiment was actually being conveyed to a great extent by one particular organization that was having these meetings. It was the Great War Veterans Association. So of course the war ended in 1980 or 1918, I should say. So 1920, so veterans had come back. And here we know that Japanese Canadians, over 200, volunteered in the First World War. They fought the war. And part of fighting the war was to say that as Asian descent individuals, we have the right to be Canadians. We are fighting for Canada. So I've laid out some background, and the picture that you see is actually Cumberland's Chinatown. And this is to remind us that we need to know some of this history, because we see it being raised over and over again in the present. So desiring labor, but not valuing the laborer. Think about it in terms of migrant labor workers in the orchards, right? What are their living conditions? What were the living conditions way back when, 100 years ago, 100 plus years ago, when the railway was being built, right? This notion of people taking over jobs. What were their rights? There's lots of questions that we have today that when I hear them, they're just repeating what happened well over 100 years ago. So I'll leave you with that as part of a background to thinking about the roles that Asian Canadians played in the building of quote unquote modern BC. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Imogene. We do have a question from the audience to you. Someone asked, why did so many people of Chinese ancestry settle in Cumberland area?
The mining. So this is the thing, constant exploitation of labor. So Cumberland actually, well, like in many of these smaller communities that were extractive resources, they had mixed populations. So if you go to Cumberland, there were Japanese, there were Chinese, there was even miners, African American miners from Pennsylvania who lived there. And in that early portion of, Cumberland and the Chinese, Dunsmuir brought in Chinese as strike breakers. Chinese also were not paid as much. Basically, they were paid half the amount of white workers. So in that hierarchy of labor, if you were of Asian ancestry, you were at the very bottom. And I believe that if you were African American, you were closer to the quote unquote white workers. And if you were indigenous, you were somewhere in between the Chinese and the white workers.
Thank you very much, Imogene. So now, if anyone has more questions about the presentation that Imogene has very thoughtfully put together, please feel free to keep putting your question in the chat. We're gonna have another quick Q&A session later after the next discussion, so you'll have another chance to get some answers from her. Thank you, Imogene. So now, with great pleasure, I would like to introduce you to our second guest tonight, Leona. Sorry to put you on spotlight for a second. So Leona is currently residing on Treaty 6 territory, which is Edmonton in Alberta. Leona Ahn is a human security advocate and a senior military officer within the Canadian Armed Forces. She is of Korean heritage and actively tries to fuse the beauties of Eastern and Western cultures in her way of being. Leona is very passionate about contributing to a more just society and progressing the rights of LGBTQ2+ women and racialized people. She is also a graduate of the Master of Human Security and Peacebuilding program from Royal Road University. I also have my colleague Bill Wang here. He's also from KCR, Community Resources, and he is the representative of Central Okanagan Local Immigration Partnership. Please welcome Leona. So I'm going to share a little slide here that will help guide our conversation today. Okay. So there are three topics we want to cover today. And the first topic is about Asian children and family that are and their experiences of racism. So I know that Leona's family moved to Canada from South Korea when she was only six years old. And Bill's family moved to Canada from Taiwan, Republic of China, when he was only 5 years old. So when did both of you start to get a sense of what racism is? What was the experience like? Shall we start from Leona?
Juan, thank you for the intro. And for the people listening in, I encourage while we're speaking to put your questions in the Q&A, because this is only going to be as fruitful as you want it. If you enjoy what we're talking about, then just let us speak, but we're here to answer any questions for the audience. So for that first question, you know, and maybe if there's any Asian people in the webinar, maybe it can resonate with them. And for some of the white folks in the room, maybe it could be a little bit of an epiphany, what my experience as a Korean Canadian is. So throughout my youth and entire adult life, you know, I have episodically witnessed and occasionally experienced systemic and overt injustices towards marginalized people. However, even as a victim of racism, what's really layered as a Asian Canadian, I've never been able to qualify, articulate, or fully understand the harmful social dynamics and racial microaggressions that covertly occur in our contemporary institutions and systems. You know, this is a precarious place to be for someone who is of Korean descent living in Canada, growing up where whiteness was always the unchanging variable. I was subconsciously forced to assimilate to be compliant to Western norms and standards in order to fit in, not be perceived as less than my white counterparts, and achieve relative success in my personal and professional endeavors. You know, I unfortunately, now I realize it in my adulthood, I have had to side with power, which has often created a dual and toxic consciousness within myself, where I've sometimes felt the need to choose between my people and my culture while pretending to be as white possible. Because it's possible to be oppressed by white supremacy while simultaneously benefiting from it, as per the model minority myth. So there's always been a significant part of me that is extremely proud to be Korean, but that pride has always been met with that discord that I'm not white, you know, and just anecdotally, you know, shamefully, when I was in high school, I was really proud to not be known as a fresh off the boat Asian. You know, instead, I was known as a banana, which for those of you that might not be familiar, means you're yellow on the outside, but white on the inside, because that meant that I was closer to that whiteness, that standard that I was assimilating with, you know. And I often found myself embarrassed by racialized people who had thick accents. You know, I stopped bringing kimchi or Korean food for lunches because it wasn't a familiar food and it emanated smells that white people might not like. And I love kimchi. So, you know, I felt internally opposed to racialized people that did not meet that model minority myth. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But essentially distancing myself from them was, and from the people that weren't completely assimilated, in my perspective, was to trivialize the uncomfortable spotlight exposed by proxy and attempt to minimize this in an immediate environment. So in that model minority myth are known to be submissive, and I didn't want to be perceived as a troublemaker. So, you know, one of the parallels that we can draw from kind of the Black Lives Matter movement is that, you know, there's a term coined by Malcolm X called the modern house Negro, and he highlights the insidious and dominant nature of white supremacy on the psyche of a Black man. And in my case, it's the Asian woman. So in this current structure. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of growing up and kind of getting into my authentic self as a Korean Canadian, but my experience immigrating to Canada.
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. Bill, would you like to share what your experience was like?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just share briefly about my experiences as a child coming to Canada. So my family and I immigrated to Canada when I was about 5 years old. Then we moved to Kelowna when I was about 6. And as a young child, one of the most ingrained things and I guess principles for me from my parents was to be better than the white person. So in that sense, it meant do everything you can, do everything possible to be the best that you can be, but do even more because you need to be better. And those are the things that resonates with me and they still stick to me to this day, unfortunately. And it kind of led me to believe that I was a second-class citizen. I was kind of forced into that model minority role as well, which we're going to be talking about later as well. At the time, my experience growing up, I didn't realize it was actually traumatizing, but in the end, it has crafted me into the person I am today. I was also very fortunate to have found outlets through sports where I could really channel my frustration, my anger, my hate into physical activity. So that definitely helped.
Thank you very much, Bill. So to both of you, did your parents ever talk to you about any racism incidents that they have experienced, or did they ever ask you about your experience? How did your parents deal with it? And also another additional question to Leona. I know that you're a mother of 2 very young children. One is 1 year old, another is 3 years old. How would you prepare them for what's coming up in the society?
Yeah, no, thank you. So your first question, absolutely, my parents were, devastated when I would come home to tell them, just sharing 2 little short stories. When I was in elementary school, I had people spit in my hair, told me to go back to my country. I had a little boy in grade 1 scrape, all over my face with a nail because he didn't want a stinky Asian girl playing with them soccer, and stuff like that. So when I would get home, they would be devastated. But that model minority myth, which we'll get into topic 2, but it's quite dangerous because it's like my parents' generation have completely internalized it. So they wanted me to be submissive, don't cause waves, just work hard, study, study, study. And they always tried to empower me to say, if you're gonna get all these qualifications or do good in school, if the 2 resumes went up and one of them was white and one of them's you, because of the similarity like me bias, they're always going to choose the white person. So you better have one more qualification, or you better have that one more higher mark, or whatever the case may be. And we just kept feeding into that loop of just work hard and everything's going to work out, and don't make waves. So with my kids, so a little bit interesting for us too is I'm in an interracial marriage. So they're halfers. Is what the slang term is, but at every opportunity I try to teach my kids to be kind and confident people. So I want them to be aware of the systemic injustices and kind of the systems that we all live in to their level of understanding. So obviously almost 4 and almost 2, they're not going to understand, but we don't shy away from those conversations, especially when they start asking. We want to raise them to be at least part of the subsection of society that will be part of the solution and not part of kind of the implicitly complicit people in society that just keeps doing harm onto racialized communities. So a couple of the tools that we use is that we choose a lot of books that speak on race, leadership, and critical thinking. We don't shy away from those things. We also diversify the types of toys and the media that they consume so that the heroine isn't always a white male. or even a white woman, but, you know, a Black girl, an Indigenous girl, or, you know, a they. We really try to look for literature, and obviously that's always hard to look for, but we do try to do that. The other thing is I think parenting is the best example of leadership. So we try to lead by example. You know, we always try to empower them so that they don't feel like victims ever, because they're going to face something, but we don't want them to default to running to, you know, their parents every time something's wrong, and that they're empowered to make choice and critically think and come to their own conclusions and solutions to navigate that, just so that it's not sugar-coated and they think that they can come and get all their problems solved from us.
Thank you, Leona. Bill, would you like to share a little bit about your parents, how they dealt with it?
Sure. I'd like to share a really quick story with you guys. It's more of incident of racism. Growing up, I remember this one time as a child, my family and I went to City Park here in Kelowna to have a picnic. And we were there just minding our own business. And I remember a group of people walking past us and making racist remarks. Some of the phrases, among others, were something like Chinese fried rice, ching chong ding dong, F you, F off, go back to China. So those things still stick to me till today, because I have a tendency to repeat these events in my head, and I go back and think about what could I have done differently? What should I have done differently to make it better for everyone else? And I remember my mother telling me not to pay any attention to them and not to mind what they say.
So
So
mother is asking you to internalize it.
yeah,
basically.
to internalize it and to be submissive and just to ignore it and let it slide. For me, I feel like the majority of racist incidents that I've experienced growing up here were really met with that non-confrontational reaction by myself and my family. So those are the things that I remember. Very much similar to what Leona said earlier on, that not making waves, not rocking the boat, that kind of deal.
Thank you very much for sharing, Bill. To our audience, if you have seen anything, if there's any thoughts you want to share, please feel free to put it in the chat box as well. And we're gonna move on to our next topic, which is model minorities. I think I just reviewed it a little bit earlier. So to explain the term, what model minority means is, basically the term was coined back in 1966 when the states were having the civil rights movement. So at that time, New York Times magazine published an article named Success Story, Japanese American Style. So basically they are praising Japanese Americans because they were law-abiding, they achieve academic success, they are hardworking, and they get a positive outcome despite the past oppression they have experienced during Second World War. At the same time, they are basically naming Black people as a problem minority. So the Japanese American were praised as a model minority, and the Black people are basically named as problem minority who contend with poor health, poor education, and often low income low income as well. So this is actually being used against the civil rights movement. So basically they're trying to say that, oh, if Black people shifted their values and focus more on education, focus more on work, they could succeed too, like the Japanese Americans were. So the model minority stereotype has since grown and been applied to Asians across many ethnicities. It is the cultural expectation placed on Asian Americans and Asian Canadians, and basically seeing each individual in the group as someone that should be naturally smart, very good at math, science, technology. They're wealthy, they're hardworking and polite, they're quiet, they're submissive, they don't complain about things, so that they are less likely to experience racism. That's the idea they're pitching. So now I would like to ask Leona and Bill to share your perspective on this topic. Would you like to go first this time, Bill?
Sure. Yeah. So from my perspective, that model minority is really it serves as a reference for other minority groups on how to be successful. That notion that Wan mentioned earlier, that notion of being quiet, being well behaved, being that obedient citizen, it really creates that distortion in our demographic. But really, I just want to highlight in summary, it's very insidious by nature. We talked about this earlier because it really pits minorities against each other, really. And this is something that is grown and grown over the years in our history.
Okay, Bill. Leona?
Yeah, so, the model minority myth, it really dehumanizes Asians in particular, I think. And like you mentioned, it really pits us against each other. And another really dangerous thing is that this system reduces race relations into hierarchies and binaries instead of allowing unique expressions of privilege and oppression to simultaneously exist. And what this creates too, you have it on the slide right there, submissive and uncomplaining. So I'm pretty sure when people hear like, oh, Asians are impacted by racism too, like if there was a totem pole of, the hierarchy of race, they would put white and probably Asian next to it or right below it, because what the model minority myth has created is we are pandering to whiteness. We stay silent in the face of injustices. We could harbor anti-Black mindsets. We let microaggressions go just so that we could be siding with power. And it's a method to survive, basically. And we have this inability, because of how strong the model minority myth is sometimes, the inability to center our own community for solidarity, unity, and to kind of go. So the oppressed really, I'm sure everyone's heard this, instead of striving for liberation, tend to become oppressors themselves sometimes. And we just really need to realize that our liberation is all tied, intermingled, interdependent on each other. And when we individually stop repeating the behavior of our oppressor, we can really truly begin to heal our communities as well as everyone else's.
Thank you, Leona. So what are the, where do you think that we can start to fight the model minority myth? I know you have given some suggestions. Bill, do you have anything that you want to add to how we can break down the model minority myth? I find it's actually hardest among our own group.
I think so as well. I think we're doing just that right now. This opportunity here to build awareness through education and really acknowledging that the stereotype or the model minority is harmful, and understanding the effects of it is part of that process. So being with us here today is really actively working towards it.
Thank you very much, Bill. I just thought of an example as well. In the recent years, it has been on the news that there were Asian children, like Indian children or Chinese children that are second generation immigrant, they're growing up here. They have been pressured so much by their parents that they, in the end decided to hurt themselves or commit suicide, because getting a good grade at school is not enough. They somehow have this expectation that Asian kids should be skipping grades in order to prove that they're successful, and that's totally playing towards the model minority myth. So let's move on to our next topic. Thank you very much for the discussion. Microaggression. So microaggressions are defined as everyday, subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that that communicate some sort of bias towards historical marginalized groups. So the term here, microaggression, micro does not mean that this is very small there's no threshold that says, oh, this is too small, we can ignore it, we can let it bypass. It's not racism, it's not microaggression, but it just means that we encounter it every day. It does not mean that microaggression does not have big life-changing impacts. So I want to start with asking Leona, in your perspective, why these conversations that contain microaggression or acts of microaggression could be harmful to Asian Canadians, and that same question goes to Bill as well. I'm going to move to this slide. So basically, here are a few examples that's being gathered by some amazing people in Vancouver. I was attending a workshop on microaggression, and literally, I actually have a screen full of the microaggression encounter people have on a daily basis. And here are just a few examples that I asked Leona and Bill to comment on.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wan. So I'll just pick a couple off this slide. So, the first one, being ignored as if my opinion can't be right or not important. Essentially, this comment might seem like not that big of a deal, but it internalizes that negative stereotype about people of color and believes that whites are smarter and superior to people of color, believe that people of color aren't competent and are only hired on to or promoted to fill quotas or targets. It's just like that. We cannot fathom a world that an Asian or a Black person or Indigenous person just got there by pure competence. There must have been a quota. Cultural food seen as gross or weird. It's what is the centering. The centering is the white cultural norms, the practices, the values, the foods, superior and better and normal. So everything that's divergent to that is gross or weird. And, this one is something that's really pervasive in the Asian women. I would say, if a guy likes you, it must have a fetish, and it's not about you, it's about your race. So, fetishization, sexualization, and marginalization of Asian women, it dehumanizes us and leads to violence, actually. And it plays right into that submissive and assimilate to that white male imagination as the focal point again. So, kind of a crude example, but, not quite the happy ending I was looking for. I have yellow fever. We really can't be seen as individuals, or heaven forbid that someone could possibly like you and not just defined by your race. So those are kind of just to unpack a couple of those microaggressions and why they could be so harmful. It's a death. It's a cut of 1,000 cuts, basically.
Thank you, Leona. Bill, I know you can probably speak to one point for sure. Asian men aren't sexy, and this is before Crazy Rich Asians, because I know Bill is actually in an interracial marriage himself as well.
Sure, I can speak to a little bit of it. I think that this stems from that model minority and submissive nature of the group, that thought of the Asian man is intellectual. He's not as what is defined as masculine or masculinity. It goes against its nature itself. Really, it's hard to say, hey, this guy is really great looking or this guy is sexy, because it's not to the standard of what's normal, what's common right now. I guess it's changing because there's movies like The Crazy Rich Asians that's also shown the reverse effect of that too. But I also want to talk really quickly about a couple other points. Leona mentioned the fetishization. I've had a similar experience growing up as a child as well, or even in high school. I remember people contacting me and messaging me directly on Facebook and saying, hey, you look like that K-pop person. And saying that, oh, that I'm so like they like it, so that's why they're messaging me, and that's what they're showcasing. It was an odd interaction. I didn't really know how to handle it as a child. I just kind of ignored it, like most things. But those are some of those experiences too. The other one here says, you're so Western, you don't seem very Chinese or Korean or Indian. one story I'd like to share really quickly about that is when I was in school and I was on exchange, I had the opportunity to study in Austria. And in one of the classroom settings, it was a international business, and the instructor at the time went around the room and asked everyone to share a little bit about their culture's history and the business field. And I was asked to share about Chinese history and in business. So I pointed out right away that I'd actually come from Canada. And so that visual appearances to them maybe deceiving at the time, but making assumptions based on a person's appearance is definitely wrong in any case.
Thank you very much, Bill. So is there anything else that you would like to add to how we can combat microaggression for both Leona and Bill?
Yeah, I guess I'll just end with just 3 points that I thought of on, how you can be an ally, how you can be, with us in solidarity. The first one is, don't think about racism as the difference between good people versus bad people. The fallacy of socializing racists as bad people who commit intentional racist acts towards individuals rather than as a complex, interconnected system. This kind of rudimentary understanding of racism has allowed, predominantly white people, but also Asians, to exempt themselves from the forces of socializations in the cycles of oppression. So, what I mean by that is we're often socialized to take existing social organization as normal, which manifests in our attitudes, our behaviors, our practices, and that's what maintains those long-standing inequalities. So separate intention and impact. No, I didn't mean to be racist. Of course you didn't. We would hope that every human being that walks around, 99% of the time aren't trying to be racist. But if someone tells you and says, hey, that hurt my feelings, that was racist, that's racial microaggression, that you're able to de-link yourself, have the emotional maturity and the fortitude to be able to separate. Just because that happened doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, but be aware that racism is an interconnected and complicated system. The second thing is make a commitment every day to anti-racism at the micro level. We're in that social media age, so it's really easy to throw up the Black Lives Matter, the Black Square, whatever, orange square, whatever's going on right now, right? But we are hesitant to do it in our own living rooms, in our own classrooms, in our institutions, in our boardrooms. And that is where it matters. Okay, so that is what I mean by that micro level. And make that commitment and also be cognizant that reading about anti-racism doesn't necessarily make you anti-racist. Just like how if you read a book on mountain biking, you're not a mountain biker. It takes practice, it takes emotional labor. It's very uncomfortable. It's a lifelong commitment, even for myself as a racialized person, intersecting in very different ways and very socialized, indoctrinated. You heard in my bio, I'm in the Canadian military, which is, inundated with just white males. I have to do a lot of unlearning every single day, but I make that commitment. So that's one thing there too. And then the last one is step up as allies and don't put that work of transformation solely on the backs of racialized labor. Diversity is the practice of mixing together different bodies within a common organization. And it's a prime resource to be capitalized upon by organizations that are white owned and operated. Rather than honoring the differences and distributing that power, diversity has actually been used as a tool of white supremacy that is celebrated for being inclusive, but exploited for its economic value and social capital. So focusing on diversity and inclusion are essentially nicer terms to assimilation. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we necessarily position marginalized groups as naturally needing to assimilate to the dominant ones, rather than to undermine the said structures of dominion, or domination. So get involved. Don't talk for the racialized people in your organization, but create the space and be engaged in it. Don't center yourself in that work. But if you're tired about learning about racism, you know, imagine how tired you'd be if you had to experience it. So do that micro work, and not just the performative and virtue signaling that we see all the time.
Thank you so much for the great suggestions. That's a lot of rich knowledge that you are bringing to us as well. I'm very well aware of time, but because we made this promise on the agenda and we kind of started a little bit late as well, so I think it's fair to extend a few minutes. We're gonna go through some resources that I would like to share with you from Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network. And meanwhile, if you have more questions, please feel free to post it in the chat box. I did see that Dr. Shirley Chow and Dr. Imogene Lim has already started a great discussion with a lot of information and knowledge in the chat there. So thank you very much. I'm gonna continue here. So the Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network offers a multi-level provincial-wide approach with greater focus and leadership in identifying and challenging racism. So the program connects communities with information. They support the training that we're able to offer to the public, and they help prevent future incidents of racism and hate. We all work together to do this hard work and make this vision a reality. So this is a quick look of all the Resilience BC. We call them spoke. So I'm a spokesperson as well at KCR for Central Okanagan region. So yeah, we do have a provincial-wide network. And if you go on Resilience BC's website, you can find the community spoke on the list there. You can find lots of anti-racism resources that can support you through this journey. You can find experts. For example, we had a community member asking about EDI auditing, which stands for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So you can find all of the kind of the resources on Resilience BC website as well. And last, you can get lots of support from this network. And on the grassroots level at KCR, we call our project United Against Discrimination. It's supported by UBC as well as Resilience BC. We try to do our best with public education. So KCR is actually going to offer diversity and inclusion training coming up in late summer, in the fall, and in early next year, so the winter as well. So there will be 3 sets of 2 sessions of diversity and inclusion training, and the training will be based on a JIDI system, which means justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. There are lots of topics that will be covered during these trainings and will be free and open to the public, so stay tuned. And services for victims, we are actively receiving incident reports from bystanders and victims, and we try to provide support and resources the best we can. We also have a coalition that's standing behind this United Against Discrimination project. So we do have the police department on board with us. We also have school district 23, Okanagan College, and the University of British Columbia involved. So this is just a quick screenshot of KCR's website. If you go on www.kcr.ca, you can see on this bright orange box that this is a quick introduction of the United Against Discrimination initiative. And if you click on the report and incident button, it will take you to a secure link, and all of the information you provided there will be confidential and safe with us, unless you provide us with your contact information and indicate that you would like us to support you and follow up, then we would contact you, but otherwise everything remains anonymous and safe. You can also find a list of anti-racism resources that are available by the other link here. So, and that's the last slide, I promise. What we promise is to share with you something that you can take away. So anti-racism work isn't easy. Here are a couple of tips that can make it easier for you and can make it better and help you to go through the journey. And, you know, we need to make sure everything's sustainable for you. So first of all, eat well and get good sleep. Being hungry or being tired does not mix very well with learning and self-reflection. So your mental health is completely connected to your physical health. So exercise, eat healthy food, drink lots of water, have a solid sleep routine will help boost your mental health and your physical health. Connect with the others, even though we're living through the pandemic, reaching out and connect with people is difficult, but it is necessary for you to try to talk honestly and authentically about how you're feeling. You can also reach out to us at KCR, and we have a coalition behind us. As I mentioned, there are a couple of members that are very supportive. They would love to have a conversation with you if you need some support. And third, breathe. So there are many times when you're exploring the activities around anti-racism work and you start holding your breath and you're experiencing a sense of pressure. And this is when you need to catch up with your breath, focus your attention on calmly exhale and inhale, and it really helps calm your mind down. So you can process information and the knowledge. And fourth, seek joy. Fighting racism is important and most of the time not very fun because it's a hard topic. While doing this work and growing your anti-racism knowledge, it's easy to forget that you need to seek out joy. So give yourself the chance to create some positivity, engage in some joyful activity to find that joy inside yourself. And last, find hope for the future. You have taken the steps to make your community a better place and make a meaningful difference in the lives of the others. So remember that your action will make a difference and shape a better future for all of us in Canada. So that will be it. Thank you very much. I'm gonna stop sharing the slide here. I'm not sure why we still have Leona on the spotlight. Maybe I can change the view here. So I'm sorry, I haven't been reading chat. Terry, did you capture any questions from the audience?
No, I don't think. There's been awesome discussion. And I think there may be a couple questions that I think have sort of been answered in the chat. So I don't think there's anything. But are people okay to stay a bit? And if people have questions, we could have a little discussion, so perhaps.
Yeah. I think we can probably stop the recording from here.
Yes, okay.
And open up the floor if anyone wants to share.